What if everything you learned about medieval history was just a fraction of the full story? Picture this: a traveler from the past leaves behind a mysterious object, its true meaning buried for centuries. No textbook mentions it, no classroom teaches its significance, yet it holds the key to an entire chapter of human experience, erased from the record. Today, we're dusting off these forgotten treasures, uncovering 22 artifacts that rewrite the narrative of the Middle Ages. These aren't just relics, they're time capsules, each one revealing secrets about power, culture, and everyday life that challenge what we thought we knew. Think about the last time history surprised you. Maybe it was a footnote about an overlooked invention or a ruler whose name barely made the pages. But what if those footnotes were the real story all along? Across continents and kingdoms, ordinary people and leaders alike left behind clues, objects that tell tales of trade routes that defied borders, technologies that predated their time, and cultural exchanges that shaped the world in ways we're only beginning to understand. Some were hidden deliberately, others were simply overshadowed by the grand narratives of kings and conquests, but now they're stepping into the light. This journey isn't just about rediscovery, it's about reimagining. How different would our understanding of the medieval world be if these artifacts had taken center stage? What lessons about resilience, innovation, and connection have been waiting all this time to be heard? From a simple coin that reveals a lost empire's reach to a manuscript that hints at scientific ideas centuries ahead of their time, each piece we'll explore is a puzzle waiting to be solved. So let's dive in, because history isn't just about the stories we've been told. It's about the ones we're finally ready to hear. The Voinish Manuscript doesn't just defy translation, it defies explanation. Imagine holding a book where every page whispers secrets in a language no one alive can understand. Written in the early 15th century, its pages are filled with looping, alien script and drawings of plants that don't seem to exist, twisting roots, leaves unlike any known species, even celestial charts mapping unknown stars. For centuries, cryptographers, linguists, and historians have tried to crack its code. Some believe it's a sophisticated cipher hiding alchemical formulas or herbal remedies. Others argue it's an elaborate medieval prank crafted to baffle future generations. But here's what's undeniable: someone went to extraordinary lengths to create it. The vellum pages, the meticulous inkwirk, the sheer labor involved. This wasn't doodling in the margins. It was a deliberate act of preservation, as if the author feared some knowledge would vanish unless locked away in plain sight. Consider the context. This was an era when books were rare, expensive, and often controlled by the powerful. Monasteries guarded libraries like fortresses. So why would someone produce a volume so strange, so deliberately opaque? One theory suggests it was meant for a select few, perhaps a secret society or a lone scholar experimenting with ideas too radical for their time. The illustrations hint at something deeper: diagrams of tiny nude women bathing in interconnected tubes, strange cosmological symbols, even what looks like a microscopic view of cells, centuries before microscopes existed. Could it be a glimpse into lost scientific traditions, or simply the wild imagination of its creator? The manuscript's journey only deepens the mystery. It resurfaces in the 17th century, owned by an alchemist who claimed it was the work of the 13th century scholar Roger Bacon. Then it vanishes again, only to reappear in 1912, when a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich stumbles upon it in a Jesuit library. Since then, even artificial intelligence has failed to decode its meaning. But perhaps the real lesson isn't in cracking the code, it's in what the manuscript represents: the tantalizing possibility that medieval minds were grappling with ideas far beyond what we've credited them for. Now shift your gaze from the enigmatic to the unsettling. If the Voinish Manuscript hints at hidden knowledge, our next artifact reveals the grim realities of medieval medicine, a world where hope and horror walked hand in hand. The Leechbook of Bald reads like a bridge between two worlds, one foot planted in the careful observation of nature, the other stepping into the shadowy realm of spirits and incantations. Compiled in 10th century England, this handwritten medical manual doesn't just prescribe herbs and poultices. It speaks in charms, invoking saints and ancient gods to drive out disease. Take one remedy for a headache: crushed herbs mixed with wine, applied to the forehead but only while reciting a prayer to Saint Peter. Was this superstition or something more? To the Anglo-Saxons, the answer might have been simple: why choose? What's startling is how often their methods worked. Honey smeared on wounds to prevent infection, a practice modern science now confirms fights bacteria. A salve of garlic and onion for skin ailments, ingredients we know have antimicrobial properties. Yet flip the page and you'll find instructions to cure a fever by tying a worm around your neck or banishing a demon with a knife carved with runes. This wasn't ignorance, it was a world view where every illness had both a physical and supernatural cause. A healer had to treat both body and soul. Consider the book's very existence. In an age where medical knowledge was often guarded secrets passed between masters and apprentices, this compilation was revolutionary. Written in Old English, not Latin, it made healing accessible beyond monastery walls. The recipes read like a cookbook for survival: how to stitch a wound with silk thread, which plants could ease childbirth, even a rudimentary eye surgery to remove cataracts. But woven between these practical steps are whispers of older traditions, invocations to Woden, the Norse god of wisdom, alongside Christian prayers. It's as if the scribes knew some truths transcended the boundaries of faith. Now imagine holding this book in your hands, its pages stiff with age. Every stain and smudge tells a story, a spilled remedy, a healer's hurried notes in the margin. This wasn't abstract theory, it was life and death on parchment, and that's what makes it so extraordinary. While we might dismiss the charms as fantasy, they reveal a profound truth about medieval minds: the willingness to use every tool available, whether from the earth or the heavens. But if the Leechbook shows how medicine balanced between worlds, our next artifact reveals a tool designed for one brutal purpose: to shatter the old ways of war. A weapon so devastating it didn't just win battles, it redrew the map of power in the Middle Ages. The Ulfbert swords shatter everything we thought we knew about medieval metallurgy. Picture a Viking warrior gripping one of these blades, its steel so pure, so advanced, it wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 800 years. Etched with the name Ulfbert in bold letters, these weren't just weapons, they were marvels of engineering, forged from crucible steel at temperatures once thought impossible for the time. But here's the twist: this technology supposedly didn't exist in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. So how did Viking smiths crack the code centuries ahead of schedule? The secret lies in the steel itself. Unlike the brittle, slag-riddled iron common in medieval Europe, Ulfbert blades contained carbon levels rivaling modern high-grade steel, flexible yet deadly sharp. Metallurgists have traced the ore's origins to mines in Central Asia, a staggering revelation. This wasn't just local craftsmanship, it was evidence of a vast trade network stretching from Scandinavia to the Islamic world, where crucible steel techniques were already mastered. Imagine the journey: raw materials traveling thousands of miles, passing through countless hands to reach forges in the Viking homelands, who brokered these deals. Were they merchants, diplomats, or perhaps even warriors returning from distant raids? But the real mystery is the name itself, Ulfbert. Over 100 swords bear this inscription, yet they span 2 centuries and vary wildly in quality. Some are masterpieces, others are crude imitations. This suggests Ulfbert wasn't just a single smith but a brand, a medieval trademark signaling prestige. Think of it as the Viking equivalent of a luxury label, with lesser smiths scrambling to copy the originals. Yet the finest blades share eerie similarities with Damascus steel, the legendary Middle Eastern metal. Could Ulfbert smiths have apprenticed under foreign masters or stolen the secrets outright? The sword's impact was catastrophic for those on the wrong end of them. While most European armies fought with swords that bent or shattered mid-battle, an Ulfbert could slice through armor like parchment. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a status symbol, a psychological weapon. Wielding one signaled you had connections, wealth, and access to technology your enemies couldn't comprehend. But power like this invites scandal. By the 12th century, the Ulfbert name vanishes from history along with the knowledge to make them. Were the workshops destroyed? Did trade routes collapse? Or was the secret deliberately buried to maintain the advantage of a privileged few? Now, turn your attention from the forge to the courtroom. Because our next artifact doesn't just reveal lost technology, it exposes a royal deception so brazen, it rewrites the history of medieval diplomacy. A single piece of parchment, stamped with a seal that shouldn't exist. The crown of Anne of Bohemia sits silent in the Tower of London, a hollowed-out shell of its former glory. Once studded with sapphires and pearls, its gold frame now stands bare not from time's wear but by deliberate erasure. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a political weapon, and its dismantling tells a darker story. Anne arrived in England in 1382, a 14-year-old bride to King Richard II, hailed as a peacemaker between warring kingdoms. For 12 years, she wielded influence unlike any queen before her, mediating conflicts, pardoning rebels, even funding the first English translation of the Bible. Yet within months of her death, records of her reign were scrubbed clean. Her crown, literally defanged of its gems, became a metaphor for how power reshapes history to fit its needs. Look closer and the crown's empty settings whisper secrets. Each missing stone represents a calculated snub to her family, her homeland, her legacy. The Bohemian court had sent Anne to England laden with treasures, a display of cultural sophistication that dwarfed England's own. Her coronation crown, likely crafted by Prague's master goldsmiths, was a statement. Continental Europe's artistry outshone England's. But after her death, Richard's enemies seized the throne. The new regime couldn't erase Anne's popularity, so they stripped her symbols instead. The gems were pawned to fund wars, the gold alone remained, a ghost of what once was. What makes this artifact so chilling isn't just the act of destruction, it's the precision. Historians found inventories listing every jewel removed, as if the dismantling were a bureaucratic duty. This wasn't petty theft, it was a rewriting of history in real time. Anne's diplomatic triumphs, her patronage of scholars, her role in curbing Richard's tyranny, none of it aligned with the narrative his successors needed to sell. So they turned her crown into a prop for their own story, a foreign queen whose contributions could be melted down when inconvenient. Yet the crown's very survival as a hollow relic tells us something remarkable. However much the powerful tried to bury Anne's memory, the frame endured. Like those who secretly kept her portraits or copied her banned translations, someone ensured this symbol wasn't lost entirely. Perhaps that's the real lesson here. Even the most thorough erasures leave traces. The empty crown doesn't just memorialize what was taken, it testifies to what couldn't be fully erased. Now shift your gaze from the corridors of power to the bustling docks of the medieval world, because our next artifact doesn't just cross borders, it reveals a web of connections spanning continents, proving globalization didn't wait for the modern age. A single shard of pottery, unearthed thousands of miles from home, holds the key to a trade network more vast than textbooks ever hinted. The Mapa Mundi of Hereford isn't just a map, it's a portal into the medieval imagination. Stretching over 5 feet of calfskin, this 13th century masterpiece doesn't merely chart cities and seas. It weaves together scripture, legend, and travelers' tall tales into a single cosmic vision. Jerusalem sits dead center, not as a pin on a grid but as the literal heart of the world, radiating divine order. To the east, the Garden of Eden nestles beside the Ganges River, guarded by winged serpents. To the west, the edge of the known world bleeds into monsters straight from bestiaries, dog-headed men, one-footed tribes who use their giant feet as sunshades, even a phoenix mid-rebirth. This wasn't cartographic ignorance, it was a deliberate tapestry of belief, where every creature and landmark carried symbolic weight. Consider the audience unrolling this map in Hereford Cathedral. For them, geography wasn't just about distances, it was a moral landscape. The farther you traveled from Jerusalem, the stranger and more perilous the world became, not because medieval people lacked curiosity, but because they saw exploration as a spiritual journey. Notice how the map's edges dissolve into chaos. Here be dragons, yes, but also the gates of hell swallowing the unwary. This wasn't fear-mongering. It was a warning that venturing beyond Christendom meant risking both body and soul. Yet amid the fantastical, startling accuracy peeks through. Scandinavia's shape is recognizable. Rome and Paris appear roughly where they should be. Even the Nile's course mirrors reality, though it's depicted as flowing from a lake in West Africa, a detail that baffled historians until modern satellites confirmed underground aquifers in the region. The map's true genius lies in its layers. Flip it mentally like a transparency, and you'll see how it served multiple purposes: a pilgrimage guide for the faithful, an ideological tool for the church, even a storytelling canvas for merchants spinning yarns about distant lands. That dragon in the north, perhaps a garbled account of Arctic ice shifting. The giant ants guarding gold in India, likely echoes of Herodotus's tales passed down through centuries of retelling. What seems like childish fantasy to us was, for its time, a cutting-edge synthesis of available knowledge, limited, yes, but fiercely ambitious in scope. Now shift focus from parchment to shadows, because our next artifact reveals a world where information wasn't just recorded, it was stolen, smuggled, and weaponized. Hidden beneath the floorboards of a Venetian palace, a set of forged letters would expose the dark art of medieval espionage. The Cipher of Mary, Queen of Scots, isn't just a collection of letters, it's a prison of ink and desperation. Picture this: a queen stripped of her throne, confined in an English manor, her only weapon a pen and a cipher so complex it would take 400 years to crack. Each page is a battlefield, every symbol a soldier in her secret war against Elizabeth I. When modern codebreakers finally deciphered these messages in the 20th century, they uncovered more than political intrigue. They found the raw pulse of a woman refusing to vanish into history's shadows. The letters reveal a masterclass in covert strategy. Mary didn't just encode her words, she embedded them in innocuous-seeming correspondence, notes about embroidery or complaints of illness that masked pleas for rebellion. One particularly damning message, smuggled inside a beer barrel, outlined plans for her escape and a Catholic uprising to overthrow Elizabeth. But here's what's chilling: the cipher wasn't merely functional. It was theatrical. Mary used over 50 distinct symbols, some representing whole words, others single letters, with null characters sprinkled throughout to mislead interceptors. This wasn't just secrecy, it was psychological warfare designed to frustrate and humiliate her captors if they ever laid hands on it. Yet the real story isn't in the code itself, but in the hands that carried it. A network of loyal servants, often at mortal risk, ferried these letters between castles. One courier, a Catholic priest named Gilbert Curl, was tortured for months after being caught, yet never revealed the cipher's key. That unwavering loyalty hints at something textbooks often overlook: Mary's charisma. Even imprisoned, she inspired devotion powerful enough to make ordinary people defy an empire. When Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, finally intercepted and decoded the letters, they became the smoking gun that sealed Mary's fate. But historians still debate: were the letters genuine, or did Walsingham embellish them to justify her execution? The ink blots and corrections in the originals suggest haste, perhaps Mary's own hand, scrambling to rewrite a compromised phrase. Or were those very smudges planted to implicate her? The cipher's brilliance is that it leaves room for doubt even now. Now, shift your gaze from the high-stakes world of royal espionage to something far more ordinary, yet equally revolutionary. Because our next artifact didn't topple thrones, it transformed kitchens, workshops, and the very rhythm of daily life across medieval Europe. The Astrolabe gleams like a bronze spiderweb, its finely etched rings and pointers catching the light with quiet brilliance. Far from a simple navigational tool, this handheld marvel was the medieval world's closest equivalent to a supercomputer capable of telling time, predicting star movements, even calculating the height of mountains. Imagine a traveler in 12th century Spain holding one aloft, aligning its rotating discs to measure the angle of the sun. In that moment, they weren't just finding north, they were tapping into a scientific tradition stretching back to ancient Greece, refined by Islamic scholars, and now humming in their palms. What makes the Astrolabe so extraordinary isn't just its precision, it's its universality. Surviving examples bear inscriptions in Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew, often on the same device. This wasn't just a tool, it was a crossroads of knowledge. Muslim astronomers like al-Zarqali in 11th century Toledo perfected its design, adding gears to account for shifting constellations. Christian monks adapted it to calculate Easter's date. Jewish scholars used it to determine prayer times. Each culture left its fingerprints on the brass, proving that scientific progress in the Middle Ages wasn't a linear march, it was a collaboration, often hidden by the noise of wars and crusades. Consider the Astrolabe's quiet rebellion. At a time when some church authorities insisted the Earth stood motionless at the universe's center, this device taught its users otherwise. By tracking planets' erratic paths, it hinted at a solar system far more complex than medieval dogma allowed. Yet because it served practical needs guiding ships, timing harvests, it slipped under the radar of censorship. Farmers checking planting seasons or merchants navigating trade routes became unwitting students of celestial mechanics, their understanding of the cosmos deepening with every calculation. The craftsmanship boggles the mind. Master metalworkers engraved scales accurate to fractions of a degree, their hands steady as they etched constellations smaller than a grain of rice. Some astrolabes even featured interchangeable plates for different latitudes, like medieval apps swapped out for new locations. And just like modern gadgets, they became status symbols. Princes commissioned jewel-encrusted versions, while scholars carried planar models, their edges worn smooth from constant use. But perhaps the most poignant detail lies in the marginalia. On the back of one 14th century astrolabe now housed in Oxford, a weary traveler scratched a note, cloudy again, will the stars ever show themselves? In that tiny grievance centuries collapse, the frustration of a medieval stargazer mirrors our own when technology fails us, bridging the gap between their world and ours. Now turn your gaze from the stars to the shadows of the scriptorium, because our next artifact didn't just record history, it smuggled it, hiding forbidden truths in plain sight beneath layers of gold and vellum. The Bayeux Tapestry stretches like a medieval comic strip, its vivid threads weaving not just the story of conquest but the whispers of resistance. At first glance, it's a triumph of Norman propaganda, 70 meters of linen celebrating William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings. But lean in closer and the margins tell a different tale. Amidst the grand battles and coronations, tiny, almost mischievous scenes unfold. A farmer ploughing his field as armies clash above him, a woman fleeing a burning house with her child, even a nude figure, possibly Harold's brother, cowering in the bushes. These aren't accidents, they're deliberate subversions stitched into the fabric by hands that may have sympathized with the defeated. Consider the tapestry's creators. While tradition credits Queen Matilda and her ladies-in-waiting, evidence points to English embroiderers in Canterbury, a city ravaged by Norman reprisals. Every stitch would have been a calculated risk. The main panels glorify William, but the borders hum with quiet rebellion. Look for the sly foxes chasing chickens, a medieval symbol for tyranny, or the dwarf mocking a knight's arrogance. Even the Latin text carries double meanings. The word treachery appears suspiciously often near Norman actions. This wasn't just art, it was descent in wool and thread, camouflaged enough to survive but sharp enough to prick consciences centuries later. What's most striking isn't the satire but the humanity preserved in these margins. While kings and bishops dominate the center, the edges teem with ordinary life. Blacksmiths forging weapons, cooks roasting meat, even a man rescuing another from quicksand. These scenes, often dismissed as decorative filler, are the tapestry's true radical heart. They remind us that history isn't just made on battlefields but in kitchens, workshops, and the quiet acts of survival. The Normans may have won the war, but the English won the narrative, smuggling their story into the very artifact meant to erase it. Now, shift your gaze from threaded rebellion to an artifact that shattered expectations in a different way. Because our next discovery doesn't just challenge history, it redefines the roles medieval women could play, revealing a warrior's grave where no warrior was supposed to be. The Birka Warrior's grave lay undisturbed for over 1,000 years, its contents whispering a truth few were ready to hear. When archaeologists first uncovered the burial site in Sweden in the 1870s, they found all the hallmarks of a high-ranking Viking fighter: a sword sharp enough to cleave bone, an axe notched from battle, a spear tipped with rusted intent, and even the skeletal remains of 2 horses, likely sacrificed to accompany their master into the afterlife. For more than a century, textbooks described this as the quintessential male warrior's grave. Then, in 2017, science spoke. DNA analysis revealed the skeleton was undeniably female. This wasn't just a correction in a dusty academic journal. It was an earthquake for our understanding of Viking society. The woman buried at Birka wasn't just armed, she was strategically equipped. A board game sat near her bones, a symbol of tactical thinking reserved for military leaders. The positioning of the weapons suggested they weren't ceremonial props but well-used tools. And her location, one of the most prestigious burial plots in Birka, a bustling trade hub sometimes called the Viking Age's New York. This was no fringe figure. She was someone the community honored with their highest rights. The backlash was swift. Skeptics argued the weapons might have been heirlooms, or that the grave held 2 people despite no evidence of disturbed soil. But here's what often gets missed. Medieval literature hinted at shield maidens all along. Norse sagas like the 13th century, Gesta Danorum, describe women like Lagertha who fought alongside men. Even Byzantine chronicles mention female Viking warriors startling their enemies with ferocity. We dismissed these accounts as myth until Birka proved otherwise. What's most revealing isn't just the warrior's identity, but how she forces us to confront our own biases. When we picture Vikings, we see horned helmets and burly men, never mind that horns are a 19th century fiction. But history is messier than stereotypes. Viking women could inherit land, divorce freely, and yes, apparently take up arms. The Birka grave suggests that while warfare may have been male-dominated, exceptions weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. Now imagine the conversations around her funeral pyre. Did her comrades hesitate to place a sword in a woman's hands, or was her skill so undeniable that gender became irrelevant? The artifacts don't say, but they scream one truth loud enough to shatter assumptions. The past was far more flexible than we've been taught. Turn now from the funeral fires of Birka to a relic that proves history isn't just written by the victors, it's sometimes hidden by them. Beneath the floor of a Spanish monastery, a single charred page survived the deliberate destruction of a worldview. The Cathar cross feels heavy in the hand, not from its weight in lead, but from the silence it carries. Discovered hidden in the walls of a French farmhouse centuries after the Albigensian Crusade, this unadorned pendant tells a story the Vatican tried desperately to erase. Unlike the ornate crucifixes of medieval Christendom, its equal-armed design is stark, almost defiant in its simplicity. For the Cathars, a sect that believed in dualism, the eternal struggle between light and darkness, this wasn't just jewelry. It was a secret handshake, a way to recognize fellow believers while evading the Inquisition's gaze. What's chilling isn't the cross itself, but where it was found. Tucked between stones in the Pyrenees, far from the bonfires that consumed thousands of Cathars as heretics, it speaks to the terror of living underground. Followers memorized scriptures instead of writing them, knowing books could burn. They met in cellars at midnight, their rituals stripped of the church's grandeur. Yet this crude cross, mass-produced in molds for easy concealment, hints at something extraordinary, a faith so resilient it thrived in whispers. The irony is crushing. The Cathars were pacifists, rejecting violence and materialism. Their heresy was challenging papal authority and suggesting the church had strayed from Christ's teachings. For that, they were hunted to extinction, men, women, and children slaughtered in the name of unity. When the last Cathar stronghold fell at Montségur in 1244, chroniclers wrote of flames so high they lit the mountainside like a beacon. But the cross survived, tucked away by someone who hoped, against all odds, that their world wasn't truly ending. Modern scholars debate whether the Cathars even existed as a unified group or were simply a convenient scapegoat for political purges. But that's what makes this artifact so haunting. It doesn't just symbolize a lost faith, it embodies how easily history can be rewritten by those who win the wars. The cross's very plainness is its rebellion, refusing to conform to the victor's narrative even now. Now, turn from shadows to light because our next artifact doesn't hide in fear. It celebrates the vibrant collisions of cultures, proving the Middle Ages were far more interconnected than Crusades and Inquisitions suggest. A single chess piece, carved from ivory in Muslim Spain, would travel farther than its maker ever dreamed. The Alhambra vase gleams with contradictions, its cobalt blue Arabic script curling around the ceramic surface like vines, praising not a caliph but a Christian king. Crafted in 14th century Granada, this masterpiece of Islamic pottery bears the name of Peter I, a Castilian ruler who commissioned it for his palace in Seville. Here's what stuns historians. The same hands that painted Quranic verses onto mosque tiles crafted this vase for a monarch whose faith condemned theirs. This wasn't just art, it was diplomacy in clay, proof that alliances in medieval Spain could transcend religion, at least for a time. Look closer at the inscriptions. The Arabic doesn't merely flatter, it weaves Christian titles into its poetry, calling Peter the Sultan and the Wise. For a moment, the boundaries blurred. Muslim artisans worked alongside Jewish translators in royal workshops, their collaborations producing objects so exquisite they became diplomatic currency. The vase's very shape, a tall, slender amphora used for perfumes or precious liquids, hints at its role. A gift meant to dazzle foreign ambassadors, whispering of a kingdom where cultures didn't just tolerate each other but borrowed freely. Yet this golden age was already crumbling. Within decades of the vase's creation, pogroms would tear through Jewish quarters, and the Inquisition's shadow would darken Granada's streets. That's what makes this artifact so poignant. It captures a fleeting reality, one where a Christian king could proudly display Arabic calligraphy in his court, where artists signed their work in scripts their patrons couldn't read but deeply admired. The vase survived precisely because it was too beautiful to destroy, even as the world that birthed it was systematically dismantled. Now, listen closely, because our next artifact doesn't speak in glaze or gold, but in melodies. Hidden in the pages of a weathered manuscript, a musical notation system so revolutionary, it would democratize music itself. The Cantigas de Santa Maria shimmer with the kind of cultural alchemy that textbooks rarely capture. Picture this: 13th century Spain, where crusades and inquisitions dominate the historical narrative, yet in the court of King Alfonso X, musicians are crafting something extraordinary. 420 songs, each one a fusion of Moorish lute rhythms, Jewish psalm-like melodies, and Christian troubadour poetry, all bound together in lavish manuscripts illuminated with scenes of everyday life. This wasn't just music, it was a sonic rebellion against the idea that medieval Europe was a battleground of clashing faiths. Take the Cantiga, Rosa das Rosas. Its verses praise the Virgin Mary in Galician Portuguese, but the instrumentation, ouds, rebecs, and frame drums echoes the soundscapes of Cordoba's mosques and Jewish wedding processions. The harmonies even incorporate the Arabic Zajal form, where call and response verses create a lively dialogue. What's startling isn't just the blending of traditions, it's the casual brilliance with which Alfonso's composers did it. These weren't token nods to diversity. The Cantigas were a full-throated celebration of hybridity, proof that shared creativity could thrive even in an age of political tension. The manuscripts themselves tell a parallel story. Marginal doodles show Muslim and Jewish musicians playing side by side with Christian minstrels, not as exotic novelties, but as equals in the royal ensemble. One illustration even depicts a Moorish dancer mid-twirl, her sleeves billowing like the Arabic muwasha poetry that inspired some Cantiga lyrics. This visual harmony wasn't naive idealism. Alfonso, a ruler desperate to unite his fractious kingdom, understood music's power to weave disparate threads into a cohesive culture. But here's the twist: the Cantigas nearly vanished. After Alfonso's death, successors distanced themselves from his multicultural vision, locking the manuscripts away. They survived not in Spanish cathedrals but in a Florentine monastery's attic, forgotten until the 19th century. Their rediscovery forces us to ask, how many other medieval artifacts celebrating coexistence were erased or buried? The Cantigas defy the lazy shorthand of clash of civilizations, offering instead a soundtrack to what could have been if history had taken a different turn. Now shift your gaze from melody to manipulation, because our next artifact doesn't harmonize cultures, it fractures truth. A single forged letter, its ink barely dry before it sparked a war. The donation of Constantine crumbles under scrutiny like ancient parchment left too long in the sun. For over 700 years, this single document held immense power, claiming the 4th century Emperor Constantine had granted the Pope dominion over Rome and all Western Europe. Popes waved it like a sword during power struggles, emperors bowed to its authority, and kings cited it to justify alliances. Then in the 15th century, a scholar named Lorenzo Valla did the unthinkable. He proved it was an 8th century fake. His evidence, the Latin itself, the forgers had slipped up using phrases and grammatical constructions that didn't exist in Constantine's time, like a criminal leaving fingerprints at the scene. But here's what's truly astonishing: the Church knew. For decades before Valla's exposé, whispers of the forgery had circulated in Vatican corridors. Yet the document was too useful to discard. It had settled land disputes, silenced critics, even helped launch the Crusades. This wasn't just historical revisionism, it was institutional gaslighting on a continental scale. Imagine the pressure on medieval scribes copying the donation for new generations, their quills scratching over words they might have suspected were lies. Yet they preserved it, not out of malice but because truth often bends to power's weight. The forgery's brilliance lay in its timing. Created around 750, when the papacy was struggling against Lombard invaders, it provided the perfect legal fiction. If Rome's first Christian emperor had willed the church political power, who could argue? Suddenly, the Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader but a sovereign, his authority rooted in imperial decree. Charlemagne's coronation in 800. Justified by the donation, the Pope's territorial wars sanctified by it, the document became a self-fulfilling prophecy, shaping reality because enough people believed it. Valla's unmasking should have been catastrophic, yet the church didn't collapse. Instead, the donation quietly faded from official rhetoric, replaced by new justifications for papal power. That's the real lesson here. Myths don't die when exposed, they evolve. The forgery's legacy wasn't its eventual debunking, but the centuries of political structures it enabled, proof that a lie, repeated long enough, can reshape the world long after it's discredited. Now turn from the halls of deception to the streets of rebellion, because our next artifact wasn't crafted to manipulate power, it was made to defy it. A simple lead badge stamped with a peasant's defiant cry would become the emblem of medieval resistance. The Peasants Revolt letters crackle with the kind of urgency that official chronicles smooth over. Written in 1481 by rebels who'd stormed London, these hastily scrawled notes weren't meant for history books. They were demands shouted onto parchment. One, addressed to King Richard II, doesn't grovel or flatter. It states plainly, "We are men formed in Christ's likeness, yet treated as beasts." That single line shatters the medieval myth that peasants accepted their lot quietly. These weren't ignorant mobs. They quoted scripture, invoked Magna Carta, and even drafted legal petitions for fair wages. Yet you'd never know it from royal records, where they're dismissed as rustics or madmen. What makes these letters extraordinary is their survival against the odds. Most were burned by victorious nobles, but a handful were tucked into family Bibles or hidden under floorboards like contraband. The ink bleeds through the parchment where hands shook with rage or fear. Some bear singe marks likely rescued from bonfires meant to erase all trace of rebellion. One note, smuggled out of Smithfield as leaders were being hanged, simply reads, "Tell them we asked for bread, not crowns." That quiet dignity undermines centuries of propaganda painting the revolt as mere chaos. The rebels' sophistication stuns modern historians. They organized across counties using coded messages, timed their march on London to coincide with tax collections, and even seized legal documents to destroy records of their serfdom. Their letters reveal a political awareness that defies stereotypes. They didn't just want lower taxes, they called for an end to feudalism itself. When they beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury, they didn't loot his palace. They burned court rolls, the very parchments that bound them to the land. This was a rebellion against paperwork as much as swords, yet the greatest tragedy lies in the aftermath. Richard initially agreed to their terms, then rescinded every promise once the rebels dispersed. The letters documenting these betrayals were systematically hunted down. That's why the few survivors matter so much. They're not just artifacts, but tombstones for voices meant to be silenced. When we read them today, we're not peering into history. We're intercepting a message meant to be lost, hearing a shout across 6 centuries that insists, "We were here, we mattered." Now, turn from the smoke of rebellion to an artifact that defies time itself, a mechanical marvel so advanced its secrets took 700 years to unravel. The Antikythera mechanism doesn't just tick, it rewrites history with every corroded gear. Found in 1901 by sponge divers off the coast of a tiny Greek island, this fist-sized bronze artifact lay encrusted with sea salt and mystery for over 2,000 years. At first glance, it resembled a lump of oxidized metal, but X-rays would reveal something astonishing. Interlocking gears, precise dials, and inscriptions detailing celestial movements with accuracy that shouldn't have existed until the Renaissance. This wasn't just a tool, it was a mechanical cosmos capable of predicting lunar eclipses, tracking Olympic cycles, and even modeling the irregular orbit of the moon. Consider the audacity of its engineering. The device used a differential gear, a mechanism thought to have been invented in the 16th century, to account for the moon's wobbling path across the sky. Its front face displayed the Greek zodiac, while hidden inner workings calculated planetary positions with a precision that would make medieval astronomers gasp. Here's the twist: it was likely built around 80 BC, yet nothing of comparable complexity appears again in the historical record for over a millennium. So why did this technology vanish? Was it a casualty of war, its creators lost to Roman conquest? Or was it simply too advanced for its time? A masterpiece that outstripped the world's ability to replicate it. The mechanism's very existence shatters the lazy narrative of linear progress. While Europe's medieval scholars were painstakingly copying ancient texts, this device proves the Hellenistic world had already leapfrogged into mechanical computation. Its inscriptions suggest it came from Rhodes, home to legendary astronomers like Hipparchus, who may have influenced its design, but the wreck where it was found. A Roman cargo ship packed with looted Greek treasures. The irony is palpable. A civilization that dismissed Greeks as decadent philosophers was literally sailing home with their most brilliant inventions stashed among stolen statues. What's most haunting isn't the mechanism itself, but the questions it leaves spinning in its wake. How many other devices like this were melted down for scrap or lost to time? Could its principles have accelerated scientific progress if they'd survived? The answers may lie at the bottom of the sea, beside the shattered remnants of a ship that carried genius as casually as wine jars. Now shift your gaze from celestial gears to something far more visceral, a kitchen tool that traveled farther than the cooks who wielded it. Because our next artifact didn't chart the stars, it flavored empires, proving that medieval trade routes were built as much on spice as on steel. The form of curry bursts with flavors that defy every stereotype of medieval food as grey, tasteless gruel. Compiled in the 1390s under the direction of King Richard II's master chefs, This manuscript reads like a culinary passport, its pages spiced with saffron from Spain, ginger shipped from the Far East, and sugar traded through Venetian merchants at staggering expense. Here's the shocker: these weren't rarities reserved for coronation feasts. Recipes call for spices by the handful, suggesting a court where cloves and cinnamon flowed as freely as wine. What's revolutionary about this cookbook isn't just its ingredients, it's the techniques. One dish, blank mang, layers shredded chicken with almond milk and rice flour, a recipe bearing striking resemblance to Middle Eastern harissa. Another, compost, mixes root vegetables with vinegar and spices, echoing the pickled vegetables of Persian cuisine. Even the title hints at global roots. Curry comes from the French cuire, meaning to cook, but the flavors dance across continents. This wasn't insular island fare, it was fusion cuisine centuries before the term existed. Consider the logistics behind a single recipe. To make a gingerbread, the royal kitchens needed honey from local apiarists, wheat flour milled by water-powered mills, and ginger that had traveled thousands of miles aboard Arab dhows and Genos carracks. Each bite was a testament to networks stretching from English orchards to the Malabar coast. The book even includes a shocking instruction for blank desire, a sweet custard, to be served icy cold, suggesting the use of snow hauled from mountain caves or imported at great cost from Scandinavia. Yet the form of curry's true brilliance lies in its democratization. Unlike secretive guild recipes guarded like state secrets, this manuscript was meant to circulate. Copies reached noble households and monasteries, spreading culinary knowledge like wildfire. A monk scribbling down a version in Yorkshire might never taste peacock or whale meat, but he'd know how to prepare them, connecting him to a world far beyond his cloister. Now turn from the banquet table to the courtroom, because our next artifact didn't flavor food, it weighed lives, revealing how medieval justice balanced on the edge of a blade. A single, unassuming object held the power to decide guilt or innocence with terrifying simplicity. The trial transcripts of Joan of Arc crackle with the tension of a battle fought not on fields but in words. Over 100 witnesses testified against her, their voices carefully recorded by notaries who could never have guessed these same pages would one day make her a saint. What's chilling isn't just the charge's heresy, cross-dressing, refusing to submit to church authority, but the way her interrogators twisted her own mysticism against her. When she claimed saints spoke to her, they demanded, "Why do they come to you, a poor peasant girl, and not to kings or bishops?" Every answer was a trap. If she hesitated, it proved her doubts. If she stood firm, it confirmed her pride. Yet the transcripts also revealed Joan's extraordinary mind. Facing educated clerics who outnumbered her 50 to 1, she parried their theology with razor-sharp wit. Asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a trick question, since church doctrine held no one could be certain, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may He keep me there." The courtroom reportedly fell silent. Even her enemies wrote of her piercing gaze, how she seemed to see through their robes and titles to the fear beneath. The real scandal lies in the trial's aftermath. After burning her at the stake in 1431, the English and their collaborators realized their mistake. They'd created a martyr. Just 25 years later, a new trial overturned the verdict, exposing how evidence had been falsified and witnesses coerced. The very system that condemned her now declared her innocent, proving how quickly political expediency could rewrite divine truth. But the most haunting detail isn't in the legal maneuvering, it's between the lines. On May 23, 1430, Joan signed a recantation, likely terrified by the pyre being built outside her cell. The next day, she retracted it, choosing fire over betrayal of her voices. The transcript captures her exact words. "What I said for fear of the flames." In that moment, the parchment stops being a legal record and becomes something far rarer, a window into a teenager's terror and courage, preserved across 6 centuries. Now turn from the smoke of Rowan Square to a relic wrapped in quiet tenderness, because our next artifact doesn't document a trial. It holds a love letter penned by a queen to the husband she mourned for 40 years. A single brooch, its gems long gone, still pulses with devotion that defied an empire's expectations. The letters between Abelard and Héloïse burn with a passion that defied both their era and their vows. Imagine parchment trembling under quills as the 12th century's most scandalous lovers poured out their hearts not in secret trysts, but in words so raw they still sting centuries later. Their story reads like a medieval soap opera. Peter Abelard, the brilliant philosopher hired to tutor young Héloïse, only to fall wildly in love with his student. Their affair produced a child, a secret marriage, and a brutal revenge her uncle had Abelard castrated. Yet what survived the violence was something even more radical, a correspondence that blended lust, theology, and intellectual equality in ways that shocked the medieval church. Héloïse's letters shatter every stereotype of passive medieval womanhood. When Abelard, now a monk, sent her a self-pitying memoir casting their love as sinful temptation, she fired back with blistering honesty. "Even under the habit of a nun, I still crave you." She quoted Ovid and scripture in the same breath, arguing that their bond transcended physicality. It was a meeting of minds the church couldn't comprehend. Abelard's replies, once cocky, grew humbler as he realized Héloïse wasn't just his lover but his equal in debate. Their later letters dissect philosophy, monastic life, and even the ethics of their own suffering with razor-sharp logic. What's astonishing isn't just their passion but their preservation. These letters should have been burned. Nuns weren't supposed to write about desire, let alone defend it as spiritually valid. Yet Héloïse's convent likely hid them, recognizing their brilliance. The parchment itself tells a tale, ink blots where hands lingered too long, margins crammed with afterthoughts, even wax seals pressed with tiny fingerprints. These weren't tidy compositions, they were living documents passed between cloisters like contraband. The real scandal lies in how modern they feel. Héloïse debates whether marriage cheapens love, a startling idea for her time. Abelard, once famed for his rationalism, admits faith can't erase heartbreak. Their dialogue flips the medieval script. She's the relentless logician, he's the wounded poet. When she writes, "I would rather be called your whore than empress of the world," it's not submission, it's a manifesto. She's claiming the right to define her own devotion, even if it defies God and society. Centuries of censorship couldn't bury these letters because they weren't just about two people. They were a crack in the medieval worldview, proving that love and intellect couldn't be neatly divided, and that some voices refused to stay silenced. Now turn from the fire of forbidden letters to an artifact that glows with a different kind of devotion, one etched not in ink, but in stained glass and stone. Hidden in the crypt of a French cathedral, a pilgrim's badge tells a story of faith that even the Reformation couldn't erase. The Jewish wedding ring from medieval Germany gleams with heartbreaking irony, its delicate filigree forming a miniature synagogue, so finely crafted that the tiny doors swing open on hinges no thicker than a hair. Meant to be slipped onto a bride's finger during the Mapa ceremony, this 14th century treasure wasn't just jewelry, it was a portable sanctuary, a whispered promise that no matter where life took them, the couple carried a sacred space with them. But here's what chills the blood. Many of these rings were buried in clay jars or hidden under floorboards, their owners likely victims of the pogroms that swept through German towns like a recurring fever. The very beauty of the object, its gold warmed by generations of touch, its architectural details echoing real synagogues, makes its survival feel like defiance. Consider the hands that held it last, in an era when Jewish communities faced escalating violence. From blood libel accusations to forced conversions, marriage became an act of resistance. The ring's symbolism was layered. The synagogue dome wasn't just decorative. It mirrored the actual houses of worship that authorities would later burn, their stones repurposed for Christian chapels. Yet the fact that such rings were commissioned at all speaks to a thriving artistic tradition. Jewish goldsmiths, often barred from guilds, developed their own techniques, embedding enamel or even tiny pearls into these wearable monuments. The cruelest twist lies in the timing. Many surviving rings date to the early 1300s, just decades before the Black Death would unleash fresh horrors, with Jewish communities scapegoated for the plague. Some rings bear inscriptions in microscopic Hebrew. Ani el dodi vade dodi lai, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. To modern eyes, these words read like a love letter to a world on the brink of destruction. Yet the rings also hint at unexpected connections. A few were found in Christian homes, possibly hidden there by neighbors trying to protect their friends' valuables. Others resurfaced in pawnshop inventories, suggesting some families managed to reclaim them after the violence passed. What's extraordinary isn't just the craftsmanship, but the duality it represents. This was a community that could envision eternity in gold even as their present crumbled. The synagogue ring wasn't just a pretty metaphor, it was a survival tactic, a way to ensure that even if the physical building was lost, its essence endured in something small enough to conceal. Today, these rings sit in museum cases, their silent eloquence outshining the shouts of those who tried to erase them. Now, shift your gaze from solemn metal to something far more playful, yet equally subversive. Because our next artifact proves that medieval people didn't just endure history, they memed it. A single doodle in the margin of a prayer book reveals a sense of humor that transcends centuries. The Lincoln Cathedral imp grins down from its perch with a smirk that survived 8 centuries of English reign. Carved into the stone high above the choir stalls, this peculiar gargoyle doesn't snarl like its fellow grotesques. It lounges with one leg crossed over the other, tongue sticking out as if frozen mid-prank. Local legend claims it was a real demon petrified by an angel mid-mischief, its playful defiance forever etched into the sacred space. But here's the twist, this imp isn't just folklore. It's proof that medieval artisans snuck humor into the holiest of places, whispering that even in an age of fire and brimstone sermons, laughter had its place. Look closer at the imp's surroundings. While most gargoyles served practical purposes, channeling rainwater away from delicate masonry, this one seems purely decorative. Its position inside the cathedral, far from any gutter, suggests it was meant to be seen by clergy, not just scare off evil spirits. Some historians argue it was a stonemason's inside joke, a sly commentary on human nature tucked between Bible scenes. Others see it as a theological paradox, a reminder that mischief and piety could coexist. After all, if even a demon could be frozen in laughter within God's house, perhaps redemption wasn't just possible, it was playful. The imp's survival is its own small miracle. During the English Civil War, Puritan troops vandalized Lincoln Cathedral, smashing stained glass and defacing statues they deemed idolatrous. Yet the imp escaped their hammers, perhaps because its irreverence didn't register as a threat, or because someone high up found it too charming to destroy. That's the real genius of this artifact, it disarms. While solemn saints and stern prophets demand reverence, the imp invites a chuckle, bridging the gap between the divine and the delightfully human. Now shift your gaze from playful stone to precise metal, because our next artifact doesn't tease the heavens, it measures them. A forgotten astronomer's device, buried for centuries, would reveal how medieval minds mapped the cosmos with startling accuracy. Hildegard of Bingen's Voinish Manuscript glows with revelations that defy the narrow box's history often tries to cram medieval women into. Picture a Rhineland abbess in the 1200s, her quills scratching across vellum as she transcribes visions so vivid they blur the line between mysticism and science. The pages burst with illustrations of cosmic eggs, fiery towers, and the human body pulsing with celestial energy, each diagram a testament to her belief that theology, medicine, and the stars were threads of the same divine tapestry. But here's what's revolutionary. Hildegard didn't just record her epiphanies, she weaponized them. When local bishops questioned her authority, she sent them Voinish as proof her insights came directly from God. The audacity of a woman claiming divine inspiration should have gotten her branded a heretic. Instead, the Pope endorsed her work, forcing the establishment to listen. The manuscript's survival is its own miracle. Unlike the neatly categorized texts of male scholars, Voinish refuses to separate disciplines. One page dissects the four humors of the body. The next maps the harmony of the spheres, linking stomach bile to planetary alignments. Her description of the soul as a living flame echoes modern neurology's understanding of synaptic sparks. Even her herbal remedies, like prescribing tansy for migraines, are now backed by science. Yet for centuries, historians dismissed her as a quirky nun with hallucinations. Only recently have we recognized her as what she was, a polymath whose work predated the Renaissance by 400 years. What's most striking isn't just Hildegard's intellect, it's her defiance of silence. At a time when women's voices were literally cloistered, she composed music, wrote plays, and even scolded emperors in letters that began, "O man of little wisdom." Voinish wasn't just a book, it was a battering ram against the idea that theology belonged to men alone. The parchment itself tells a story of resistance. Marginal notes show her nuns copying and circulating the text, ensuring its survival through waves of reformations and purges. Now, as we reach the final artifact in our journey, we find not a grand monument or a royal decree, but something far more intimate, a simple clay jar buried beneath a London shop floor. Inside, a collection of everyday objects, a child's wooden doll, a merchant's ledger, a faded silk ribbon. This isn't just a time capsule, it's a rebellion against forgetting, a deliberate act by someone who whispered to the future, "We were here." The Winchester Geese tokens lie heavy in the palm, not just from the weight of centuries, but from the silence they break. Unearthed along the Thames' muddy banks, these lead badges were once worn by the women of London's brothels, stamped with crude images of geese in flight. The nickname Winchester Geese came from the Bishop of Winchester, who licensed Southwark's brothels and taxed their workers like livestock. But these tokens weren't just markers of shame, they were licenses to survive in a world that offered few alternatives. Each one tells a story of resilience, of women carving out agency in the shadows of a society that profited from their labor while scorning their existence. Look closer at the designs. Some badges show geese with outstretched wings, others with heads bowed, a subtle hierarchy among the workers themselves. The cheapest tokens were cast in moldy lead, while a rare few bear traces of gilding, suggesting some women could afford small luxuries or favors from clients. What's chilling is how these artifacts mirror the church's hypocrisy. The same bishop who preached morality pocketed the brothel's earnings, even as his sermons condemned the women to eternal damnation. Yet the geese motif itself is defiant. In medieval symbolism, geese were vigilant creatures. Their cries famously saved Rome from invasion. Was this an inside joke among the workers? A quiet claim to their own vigilance in a world that preyed on them. The token's survival is a minor miracle. Most were tossed into the Thames after a client's visit, the lead dissolving slowly in the brackish water. That they endured at all is testament to the river's preservative silt, which also safeguarded broken pottery and lost coins. But unlike those everyday items, the Geese badges were never meant to be found. Their discovery forces us to confront a brutal truth. We know more about medieval tax rolls and royal decrees than we do about the lives of these women, despite their vital role in the economy. Court records mention them only as nuisances or criminals. Their voices are absent from chronicles. The tokens are among the few artifacts that whisper, "We were here." Now consider the broader pattern. For every Winchester goose token, how many stories have vanished entirely? The beggars, the street performers, the indentured laborers whose existences were deemed too mundane or too scandalous to document. These lead badges are more than relics, they're a provocation. They demand we question whose histories get preserved and why. When we hold one today, we're not just touching the past. We're touching an absence, a silence that still echoes. These artifacts are more than relics gathering dust in museum cases. They're echoes of voices we were never meant to hear. Each one cracks open the official story, revealing a medieval world teeming with contradictions and surprises. That Viking warrior wasn't supposed to be a woman. The Cathar cross wasn't meant to survive the fires of persecution. The Astrolabe's mathematical precision shouldn't have existed centuries before the scientific revolution. Yet here they are, stubbornly refusing to fit the neat narratives handed down by kings, clerics, and scholars. What makes these objects revolutionary isn't just what they tell us, it's what they force us to unlearn. The Middle Ages weren't some stagnant void between antiquity and the Renaissance. They were a cauldron of ideas where Muslim scientists exchanged knowledge with Christian monks, where peasant revolts quoted classical philosophy, and where a single cookbook could map trade routes spanning 3 continents. These artifacts prove innovation didn't follow a straight line from primitive to advanced. Progress zigzagged, with flashes of brilliance surfacing in unexpected places, only to be buried and rediscovered centuries later. The real lesson lies in the gaps. For every Ulfbert sword or Cantigas de Santa Maria that survived, how many other marvels were lost to war, censorship, or simple neglect? The Winchester Geese tokens only survived because they sank into Thames mud. How many stories dissolved entirely? That's the haunting question these objects leave us with. Not just what we've found, but how much has vanished because someone decided it wasn't worth remembering. History isn't a finished puzzle, it's a mosaic where half the tiles are missing. But every shard we recover, whether a queen's defiant cipher or a peasant's lead badge, changes the picture. So the next time you walk past a medieval tapestry in a museum or run your fingers over ancient stonework, pause, look closer, because the most extraordinary stories aren't always in the grand designs, but in the cracks between them, waiting for someone to listen. Your turn now. Which of these artifacts shocked you most? Have you encountered other overlooked pieces of history that changed your perspective? Drop your thoughts below. This conversation is just beginning. And if you're hungry for more stories that flip the script on the past, hit that subscribe button. The past has plenty more secrets to spill, and we're just getting started.